This is our first of a series of three, and for those I haven't met, I'm Bill Shiat, the Dean of the Institute. We thought it was important to be supporting county managers and executives and elected officials as they exercise leadership in these most extraordinary and unprecedented times. These are the times when we hope many of the tools and resources we've shared with those of you who've taken our Institute classes, you're able to put those to work. And so we're delighted to continue to support that work through the ideas of the series of webinars we're doing this Thursday and the next 2 Thursdays as well. Today, we're delighted to have two of our most favorite instructors joining us today. Dr. Rich Callahan is the principal and co-founder of TAP International. Many of you have taken his classes. He's a professor at the University of San Francisco in the School of Nursing and Health Professionals and the School of Management, a joint appointment. And Rich has been involved in the institute since day one. He was part of the initial planning that created this institute in 2008. So we're delighted to have Rich here with us again. Also joining us is Dr. Laree Kiely. Laree is the founder and chief troublemaker at We Will Inc. And also formerly a professor at the USC Marshall School of Business, and many of you have also taken their 2 classes. And I want to add, all of our faculty for these webinars are contributing their time to help support the work that you're doing. So thank you for joining us. Thank you to a number of county supervisors who have joined us. And thank you to Laree and Rich. Take it away.
Thank you, my friend. I'm going to bring up our slides here, and then I'm going to hand it over to Rich to talk to you about what we're going to discuss with you today. And it's nice to see many of you. Rich and I know many of you, and it's great to see we've got electeds on the webinar as well. So thank you for coming, and thank you for doing the hard work and the wonderful, important work that you do. So let me hand it over to Dr. Callahan and let him tell you where we're going today, and then I'll come back in a little bit.
All right, Laree, thank you very much. It's great to work with you. It's great to work with everyone who's in the class here. And it's really quite an honor to have this opportunity to work with you. And as Bill mentioned, and I give Bill a lot of credit for really pulling us together to think about how in this COVID-19 pandemic that we could be supportive of the important work of each of you in the county who are really at the front lines of this societal challenge. And so what Laree and I were glad to volunteer our time to support you and to move forward to offer some insights that you might be able to apply. So what we bring today is we've been working together on different projects with different groups for over 20 years together with public and nonprofit leaders, as well as our work on our own. We are strongly committed to the role and the contribution that the Institute for Excellence in County Government makes. Our discussion today is really based on best practices research, our own research, our professional experiences, and people that we've learned. And so we really try to bring what you would call evidence-based best practices to our discussion. And so our work is intended to support your work. I would be remiss if I didn't say how much we admire and appreciate what you're doing. So shifting to what we hope to accomplish today and work with you over the next hour, we commit to we'll finish by 4:15. We started a little bit late as people were getting access to this, and we were working out the kinks of the access. So over the next hour, what we want to really get at is leverage points that will allow you in this time of great uncertainty to lead and work effectively, tools for readiness and for resiliency, to bounce back, the ability to politely question assumptions and to recognize the need for that. Identifying early warning signs about how the uncertainty is having impact on people. Very practical tactics for learning in uncertainty, and basically how to leverage your brain under stress. So if I had to summarize what we're going to be at today is really how to help you with your interior landscape dealing with uncertainty, and also how to help with the exterior landscape in dealing with uncertainty. And so to get us started with the content, Laree will go for here for the next few moments, and then we'll follow up. So I turn things over to my dear colleague, Laree Kiely.
Thank you. And yeah, Rich and I have been working together over 20 years, and I was only 2, so it started a long time ago.
I was
Don't do the math on it.
I was 12.
So let me take on the topic, first of all, of leadership and work. We're going to have you take a poll here in a second, because many of you are in different situations around leadership and work, and some of you are supervising others, and some of you are working from home. Some of you are actually are on furlough, who knows. So let me give you this poll next, if you all don't mind. The poll itself, just answer these questions. Number 1, what's your current work status? And in fact, you may answer more than one, depending on what you may be doing a little bit of both. Your current work status. Are you going into work? Are you working from home? Are you not currently working right now? Are you supervising others? Let's get our finger on the pulse of those of you who are with us today. Looks like pretty much everybody's working. And nobody's been furloughed. That's good. Lots of folks got furloughed. And lots of folks were furloughed and then brought back recently, which is also good too. So it looks to me like about 84% of you have weighed in here. If you want to give a little bit more time to weigh in. Looks to me like, well, about 60, at this point, 67% of you are going into work. About 69% of you are working from home, and in fact, some of you may be doing a little bit of both. Only 2% not currently working, and 61% of you are supervising others. So that's kind of the guess that we had, and that's what we geared our material for today. So as we think about leading and working and so on, I want to talk about 2 things, readiness and resilience. You're hearing a lot about resilience out there, but I also want to give enough attention to readiness. So this is my particular field, and one of the things that I'm very fond of is the readiness skills. Readiness is about being in front of change and anticipating what it might be and being ready for it, as opposed to resilience, which is a little bit more like, how can we bounce back afterwards? And I'm going to argue strongly that this is an opportunity we have right now to try to create the world we think would be best, as opposed to just the one we want to go back to. But readiness has 4 skills and abilities that we'll talk about a little bit here. The first one is mental discipline, which means being able to think with discipline, as opposed to just responding from the primitive part of our brain that's worried about saber-toothed tigers. And I want to talk about bringing the prefrontal cortex, the executive function of our brain, into the party, because everyone is fearful, everyone is stressed out, high levels of anxiety and concern. Most of us are still operating with stress and anxiety being the platform that we're operating from. And I will tell you that if we don't invite in the executive function of our brain, ensure a mental discipline with this, it might get stuck at the door. It's something we have to actually invite into the party, or else it won't be there in times of crisis. So the 4 readiness skills and abilities: mental discipline, the ability to co-create, which means pulling people together to invent together the way things are going to be, both currently and in the future. Co-creation is a very powerful tool. It's way beyond things like collaboration and cooperation, which are nice, but they're too soft. Co-creation is a much more rigorous set of tools about how people interact with information and how we interact with each other and create the best outcomes, as opposed to just compromises. Because in this world, we're making it up as we go along. And then the communication, how do we interact with each other? I'm going to give you some powerful communication tools, especially if you're working with coworkers or if you're supervising. Now, how do people need to be communicated with in a time of high ambiguity and so on? And then we're going to talk about turning it into action. So that's where we're going today. And also the resilience piece. And resilience is also important. How long does it take us to bounce back after something happens? And the 3 characteristics of resilient people and organizations actually Diane Kotu did this work way back in the early 2000s, and it's more relevant today than ever. She says the people who are extremely resilient, and organizations who are extremely resilient, number one, have a staunch acceptance of reality. They're not in denial. They're not pretending like everything is fine. They've got a staunch acceptance of reality, but I would also add, they're not necessarily pessimistic. So reality and hopefulness kind of go hand in hand. They also have a deep belief, often buttressed by strongly held values, that life itself is meaningful. And the work that we do is also meaningful. They also have an uncanny ability to improvise, which means let's fix whatever is happening now and then move on, because we are co-creating it. And she says these three characteristics hold true for resilient organizations as well. Resilient people and companies face reality with staunchness. They make meaning of hardship instead of crying out in despair, and they improvise solutions from thin air. Those are resilient activities. Others don't do that. So we'll talk a little bit about what you're running into out there, what you are seeing. Because in fact, the military calls this kind of world a VUCA world. It stands for volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. It might even be what George Carlin used to call bourgeois day. It's that feeling that creeps over you that you've never been anywhere ever like this before. Just taught this in Montreal not too long ago. They thought it was bad French, which it is. But you know, we haven't been here before. This is a collective, it's both very personal and very communal what's going on. And we have to be able to navigate this with strength and with intelligence. So as we go through this today, we're going to talk a little bit more for leaders about being in the balcony and out of the dance. It's really difficult to see the patterns in the dance when you're in the dance. Ron Heifetz, as well as many others, bring up this whole concept of standing in the balcony and watching the dance so that you can see what's happening and recognize the patterns in it. And the patterns are important because oftentimes we'll try to solve symptoms of things. What we have to do is really look at the patterns and know what to solve for. Leaders know that they have to get in the balcony and get out of the dance so they can really see what they need to be working on and see what the patterns are. And in that process, let me ask you what you're seeing out there. So whether you actually supervise people or not doesn't really matter. Just what are you seeing in general? What are you seeing in the world? What are you seeing with your colleagues? Because all of you pretty much are going into work or working from home. Tell me what you think you're seeing, especially with your coworkers or with your close relationships. Are people doing fine? Do they seem to be doing okay? Are you starting to see some fraying of the edges? Are you seeing some not so great behaviors that are showing up? Are you seeing people behave better than ever before? Should probably, at least some of this should be seen somewhere. Can I not exactly tell what's going on out there? What's going on in the depths of what's going on. And also, it doesn't feel any different except we're not co-located. Let me know what it feels like to you. Yeah, so I've been running this poll for about 5 weeks now, just in various different industries and organizations and stuff. And this is exactly what we're seeing, is this kind of balance. So far, you know, the number one issue that people are starting to see is they're starting to see some fraying at the edges, where they've done some really interesting studies on people being sequestered, and they find out that there's a 3 month and a 3 week and a 7 week, and then I think it's a 12-week wall that they hit. They start out, everything's fine. They go, oh, hey, this is easy. I can handle this. And then they start realizing that they're getting a little cabin fever and they're feeling a little nervous and it doesn't feel normal anymore. So there's a certain point in a certain number of weeks where people start hitting the wall. This is what we've seen in the other polls that we've done too. The number one is starting to see some fraying at the edges. And as leaders, as supervisors, just as influencers, we're needing to pay attention to what we see out there and try to help people in that situation rather than just, oh, well, let's see what happens. That's not a good plan. And Rich is going to talk to you about just types of information at this point. And questioning the assumptions that we have in these situations. So I'll hand it back to you, Rich, and talk about questioning the assumptions that people have.
I want to help you operationalize Laree's advice here. And so what I have here is a tool that allows you to really get at what, as Laree describes, a staunch acceptance of reality. And it also allows you to improvise, or as my judo coach learned in the Marine Corps Force Recon, to adapt, improvise, and overcome. And then it really becomes part of your tool set, part of your mental discipline that Laree talked about. It becomes a way to effectively communicate to staff and to others, and is really beyond an analytical tool. It's a tool for action. So it comes from the work out of Harvard of the dean there, Richard, or the longtime faculty, Richard Neustadt and Ernest May, in a book, Thinking in Time. And it's geared towards how we learn from the past, but apply it to the challenges that we face today. And so I'll walk through it briefly and then give you an opportunity to break out in small groups and apply this. What I'm going to ask you to do is apply it specifically to COVID-19 and to explore these three questions, or this tool of questioning assumptions. So we know in public health and in other fields, there's a whole range of well-known facts, ideas. We have strategies for or understanding of infection rates and R0 and that type. And in every field, whether it's in law enforcement or public works, there were known information about how we might respond to a public health crisis, might respond to an emergency. Then there are a set of unknowns. We don't know the specifics. If it's fighting a wildfire, one of the unknowns is, where's the location going to be? You can narrow it down, but California's a big state. If it's a public health crisis, we don't know the nature of the disease that might be unfolding. So there's a range of unknowns, and we can list those. But what this tool really gets at is questioning of assumptions. What we assume to be true, but we really need to shift into the unknown column. So for those of you who I've worked with before, you'll recognize this example from a work I did with the National Conference of Cities, National League of Cities, and it was in Boston, which is important because the example came out of Florida. And their example was of two assumptions. And I tell this story, but please be assured, no one was injured in the making of this story. There's no harm done to anybody in the story when the assumptions became clear. But the legislature over 10 years ago passed a bill to get at budget reductions and also to try to help kids get more exercise. And it was to increase the radius that you had to live outside of to be eligible for free bus rides to school. And the assumption was that walking would be healthy for kids and that it could save money. There was an implicit assumption there, which was that they could walk to school safely. It turns out not to be true because of the arterial system in Florida. Oftentimes you would have an expectation that a child would need to walk on the grassy side of what we would call freeways, they'd call highways. But even more, they assumed that children would be safe walking to school from reptiles. Well, it turns out that they weren't. They'd be walking over these concrete culverts, and they call them crocodile hotels or crocodile condos, and they're not safe. The crocodiles love it because there's water and it's cool, but they could go out, and no one that I've ever heard of been harmed with this. But it's an example of a prehistoric example using reptiles of the need to question assumptions. Would children really be safer walking to school longer distances? And so what this breakout is, we're going to gear this towards, is really thinking about in the group one, an intent of this is for you to get to talk to each other. For all the Institute's program, expanding your professional network is an important element of the program. And so we want to continue that in these online sessions as well. And staff is going to help set this up, so there'll be about there'll be groups of 6 or so individuals. And in this, talk about what you, going into this crisis, what you felt would have been known from your perspective, whatever department, if you're in probation, if you're in children's services, if you're in administration, what might be the knowns and what might be the unknowns, but spend most of your time on what did we assume that we should have been listed as an unknown. And I'll defer to staff now to break us up. We'll have this for exactly 10 minutes. As you type in your assumptions with the permission of group 2, I'll talk about 2 assumptions that they identified that should have really been moved to unknowns. And the first was that the assumption going into future emergencies was that if one person had a problem, got overextended, burnout, got sick, that you could just swap out individuals. But it turned that need to be moved into unknowns, because what would needed to have had happen was that a whole team would be swapped out, not individuals. And then the second assumption that they identified was that future emergency management problems would be like public safety power shutdowns or like wildfires, and that the protocol and practices used for those could be extended to any other future emergency. And they found out that that wasn't the case here, that a future emergency should be treated as an unknown as opposed to similar to past experiences. And so as I look at the chat room, and anybody can click on chat and see this, one assumption was about timely communication and sufficient, that I assume the assumption was that there was going to be timely and sufficient communication, and that should have been treated as an unknown. There was an assumption it'd be easier to work from home and be more productive, and it sounds like that group said that should be treated as an unknown. And from breakout session 4, going into this, that there was an assumption that it would go through quickly, and an assumption that about the expense being less than it turned out to be. And there was the assumption that more people would be excited to work from home. And I think we've all experienced that with different people finding it different ways about working from home. So another assumption was that the contingency of operation had a time frame of 3 weeks closure. And clearly this exceeds any 3 weeks, but 3 weeks would be a reasonable assumption, right? Based on wildfires and other pieces. So these are really well done as you post them. I hope you found this as a helpful way to, again, operationalize Laree's ideas and the research out there on developing readiness and resiliency, and to really, we've gone through this rather quickly. The last piece I'll add, and then I'll turn it on to over to Laree, is using this exercise of what it is that we know and what it is that we don't know, and then what it is that we assume, really helps depersonalize the discussion. It allows you to more systematically, and this fits in the idea that Laree puts it there as a mental tool. It helps you as an individual, or helps you as a group, to really separate the message from the messenger, and to be analytical and not personalize any of the discussion, but just to say, you know, Rich, you're saying it and you assume it can be true, but is it really true that a public health crisis can be over in 3 weeks? And you can explore assumptions in advance. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Laree, and certainly welcome you to keep posting things on the chat feature. If there's a message you want to send to me just individually, please just click private and send it to me. And with that, let me turn things over to Laree.
Thank you, Rich. And we had a really great conversation in our room too about who we're listening to and when we get conflicting information and which assumption we choose to believe and all that kind of stuff. It's really interesting how the information comes in readily minute by minute, and it changes so frequently. It's a fluid situation, as Desiree mentioned, very fluid. And so a couple of things that we do know from the research about how to communicate with folks, because if we act like things are fact, then they will believe they are fact, and there are some problems with that. And if we find out what people really want to know, especially if we're supervising people, or even with the people who supervise us, it's important to know, here's what people really want to hear. And it's based on some really cool research that shows, in basically whenever there's change or something complex going on, what do people want to know? The first thing they want to know is, what am I supposed to do? And we often start with what's the big picture and everything else. That's not what people want to hear. What they want to hear is, what am I supposed to do? And then they want to know, am I doing it right? Am I doing it correctly? And then they want to know, does anybody care? So in this time of isolation, when people are not co-located and all we have is one dimension of one another, it's really important to recognize this is what goes on in people's minds. This is what they need. And then finally, how are we doing is what they want to know. And that's the order they want to know it in. A couple of other pieces that we know around crisis communication is that, first of all, share as many facts as possible as soon as possible. So to Rich's point, an assumption is not a fact. We know the difference between what's a fact and what isn't. So share as many facts as possible, only facts, as soon as possible. Second thing is, don't speculate, especially if you have more authority than they do, you have more influence than they do. People will take your word as gospel, and if you're just stating an assumption as if it's a fact, and speculating on the way things really are or are going to be, it gives people either unreasonable hope or it gives them terrifying anxiety. It also damages relationships and it damages trust. So going back to number one, share as many facts as possible as soon as possible. Then eliminate, because people are not listening well when they're in high anxiety and high uncertainty. Their listening skills get to be kind of dicey. We found out ages ago, we knew that you had to repeat something about 3 times in order to get people to listen to it. Now it's up to 7 times. So because people are not listening, that high anxiety keeps them from listening. So eliminate the no's, nots, nevers, don'ts, can'ts, and won'ts from your language as much as you can. Because the mind is incapable of negation. Believe it or not, is incapable of negation. Only language can negate. It's a symbolic thing. If you don't believe me, whatever you do right now, do not think of an elephant. The mind always takes the verbal order. It's incapable of the negation, so it takes the verbal order. Now I've just gotten you to think about elephants. So tell people what you do want them to imagine. We learned this in 1987 or 88 in the first interstate tower fire in downtown Los Angeles, when the fire captain said to the firefighters, don't open the fire door, and they walked over, immediately opened the fire door, and it caused a backdraft and slammed them against the wall, came close to killing them. They couldn't figure out why in the world did they do exactly the opposite of what he said. But if you understand how the brain works, you realize they did exactly what he said. So we have to be very clear and ask people to do and to think about what you want them to imagine. The fire captain should have said, keep the fire door closed. You say to a little kid, don't touch the hot stove. You've just imagined, they've gotten them to imagine touching it, imagine it's hot, imagine moving toward it. What you want to do is say to them, stop. So describe what you do want people to do and to imagine. They also stop listening when they hear the piece of information that is most important to them and to their reptilian brain. It goes straight, incoming information goes straight to the amygdala, and it tests out whether or not this is scary. And in fact, unfortunately, if it feels scary, they just stop listening. So you have to unpack the information in the right order. A while back, I was working with an organization that's trying to create an Office of Emergency Services inside their organization, and they were practicing various different situations to find out what would work best. One of these was a potential bomb threat, so they wanted to do a bomb threat warning and put people through the exercise of being safe. They got on the intercom in the building. The first thing they said was, "Don't panic. There's a potential bomb in the building. Please leave by the nearest fire escape. Please gather in the far end of the parking lot." First of all, what did you just tell them to do? You just told them to panic. And secondly, as we retested this over and over and over again, the last word that most people heard was the word bomb. Now, by that time, they're running around in the hall saying, "What are we supposed to do? Where are we going? What's going on?" And it's too late. If there's a real problem, it's too late and they don't know what to do. And they're not in the parking lot where they're supposed to be. So you have to unpack the information in the right order, which means we have to be more mindful about how we share information right now when people are in high stress and high anxiety. You get on the intercom and you say, "Please remain calm. Please leave by the nearest fire escape. Please gather in the far end of the parking lot. There's a potential bomb in the building." First of all, you've asked them to be calm, so the brain will take that order. And the last word they heard in that sequence was fire escape, most of them. Somewhere up to 75% heard fire escape last, which is okay because they're already in the right place and on their way out. So when we are in high anxiety, our brains don't necessarily work to the effect that we hope they are. And in fact, when information does go to the amygdala, to the primitive part of our brain, we end up with fight, flight, or freeze. So watch for your folks and pick up on, the weak signals. If you're seeing them behave slightly differently, you're seeing more anger, that's the fight response. If you're seeing people kind of disappearing, that's the flight response. If you're seeing them kind of bouncing off the walls, not knowing what to do or feeling a lack of confidence or withdrawing, that's the freeze response. We all have one. Figure out what yours is. Now, when you get scared, which one do you kick in first? Because we all have that. And just watch for those three kinds of behaviors and you'll start to see that you need to reach out to these folks, because if we don't pick up on the weak signals, they become screaming problems. They also end up being damaged relationships, the lack of trust with one another. We end up handling our customers poorly. Our own self-worth is compromised by not having people interacting well. So those are a few of the things we wanted to share with you, and to keep in mind that being ready is, at this point, is much better than being resilient. But I would also add, in fact, that we want to make sure that people have a safe space to process, to talk about their feelings, to talk about their fears. We need to give them a safe place. You're not therapists, so it's not group therapy. It's just let people talk about what they need to. And also ask them if they're needing advice or if they just want to have a conversation. Watch out for the idea of always thinking you have to have the answers. You don't. And sometimes that's not even what people want. If you do give advice, use the tool feel, felt, found, which is, I hear how you feel. I felt that way once too and then you're telling them your story. And I found that. What's beautiful about that is it's a way of giving advice, but it's not acting like you're the one that has the best possible answer. You're just one data point and you're sharing that with them. And this is actually received as empathy and compassion and caring, but strong. So those are some of the tools. I want to show you a real quick little video here that will help cement the issue about the difference between advice and just listening. And most of the time, people just want to be heard. They don't want you to come up with the answers. So I'll show you this video. Many of you have maybe seen this, but it'll help remember the difference or remind you of the difference between advising and how much people don't like advice when they just want to be heard.
It's just, there's all this pressure, And sometimes it feels like it's right up on me. And I can just feel it, like literally feel it in my head, and it's relentless. And I don't know if it's going to stop. I mean, that's the thing that scares me the most, is that I don't know if it's ever going to stop.
Yeah. Well, you do have a nail in your head.
It is not about the nail.
Are you sure? Because, I mean, I'll bet if we got that out of there...
Stop trying to fix it.
No, I'm not trying to fix it. I'm just pointing out that maybe the nail is causing...
You always do this. You always try to fix things when what I really need is for you to just listen.
No, see, I don't think that is what you need. I think what you need is to get the nail
See, you're
out.
not even listening now.
Okay, fine. I will listen. Fine.
It's just... Sometimes it's like there's this achy... I don't know what it is. And I'm not sleeping very well at all. And all my sweaters are snagged. I mean, all of them.
Yeah, that sounds really hard.
It is. Thank you. Ow!
Oh, come on. Ow. If you would just...
Don't...
Try to see things my way.
So that gives you an idea of how to remember the difference between listening to be heard or to hear someone, as opposed to listening to give advice. Thought I'd give you a little lighthearted way of understanding and remembering that. People really do need a place to go sometimes to be listened to and heard. Give them a safe place to do that. And the other thing I wanted to add, and then I'll hand this back to Rich, is that remind each other of the importance of the work that you do. Putting people in that mental context takes them out of the stress and anxiety and puts them in a different headspace around, wait a minute, what I'm doing matters here, as opposed to I'm just trying to show up and get stuff done. Every single one of you in the county, every single one of you does something extremely important. Half the time people don't even know what you're doing. In fact, you do it so well, the more invisible it is, the more successful you are. So you don't ever get the kind of credit you deserve, because half the time they don't even know you're doing it. But keep in mind that you know what you're doing. Everything everybody does in the county matters. They're the infrastructure of our world. And you're the ones who know that it matters. So share that with each other. Every now and then talk about, we're doing something that matters here, folks. Let's keep that in mind and talk about it, put people in a different headspace. So I hand this back to Rich to talk to you about the next piece here, about bedrock and swampy.
Well, I just want to reiterate what Laree says. I started my career in county government for 5 years in Los Angeles County. And as I've worked other places, as I've studied governance throughout the world, there's no unit of government I've ever come across that's more complex than county government. Don't think I say this to city people and then I say it to state people. County government has a complexity, and you're at the front lines. I did a program one time for what was then called the California Institute of Mental Health, CIMH, and now it's the California Institute of Behavioral Health. And when I was speaking at graduation, I just recalled, they're meeting and working with people oftentimes on one of the worst days of their lives. And so oftentimes in public safety, if you're a fire, it's not a good day when you're at someone's house, or a wildfire, children's protective services, probation, health services, public health, throughout the whole range. And the value of what you're doing, which is why we're here to support it, even on functions like the registrar recorder. I mean, you look at Georgia and you realize democracy doesn't work by itself. The voting that you take care of and that we take for granted in the counties, how well it works, you deserve enormous credit for. And so as I shift and think about the environment that you work in, a lot of the conditions that you work in, and certainly with the COVID-19, or is what my colleague Bob Biller would call swampy conditions. And swampy conditions calls for a different type of thinking and a different type of action. And Laree can switch to the next slide if that's okay. A different type of thinking and action. So I'm going to walk through these. After I get done, I'm going to ask you just to take notes yourself. We won't do a breakout group, but I want to see how you might apply this type of thinking, and you may already do it. So this would be a case of having you make explicit what you're doing implicitly so that you're able to do it regularly, and just as important, so you're able to share it with staff. So swampy conditions call for a different tactical approach than bedrock conditions. And so one is you want to avoid predetermined solutions. To look at the assumptions that were there earlier, or one of the assumptions that our group talked about, a predetermined solution for emergency response if power outages occurred was to fill up vacant space in other county buildings. Well, that's not going to work for COVID, is it? As they pointed out, you're not looking to pack people into buildings. So one is in swampy conditions, you're avoiding predetermined solutions. Second piece is your emphasis is really on learning strategies, getting as much real-time information back as quickly as possible. Again, one of the questions in the chat rooms had to do with the assumption about, thought that the science on the virus would be a lot more readily accessible. It's swampy conditions. It's going to take learning strategies call for, they really put a premium on inquiry. In swampy conditions, the best tool that you can have is the right question. And there's countless examples of where the right question makes a huge difference in moving forward. And so think about what questions you would have. Thirdly, and I don't know if you've experienced this in your county or in your work life, but in my work life, there seems to be people who always disagree. Again, you might not experience that. And when Biller first said this, it really actually, it was a shock to my central nervous system. He didn't just say, listen to dissent. I mean, it wasn't just like Laree saying, listen to listen. He said, embrace dissent. Because in swampy conditions, and you know when this happens, right? When there's someone who's been quiet at the room and you've worked on something for months and they kind of fold their arms and they just don't say much. And then you are just about ready to go forward and you find, oh, there's some statutory requirement that prevents us from doing this. And the person named Rich, let's say it's me, I said, well, I knew that. And you say, well, why didn't you tell us 6 months ago? And I'll say, well, you didn't ask. But you knew I had opportunity. Dissent is going to surface. The question is when and how. And so Biller's advice, and I think this is, once my central nervous system recovered, I believe this is good advice. There are people who disagree and say, no, that approach won't work. Well, why? What can you learn from them? And it's not just the old saying, you know, broken clock is right twice a day. It's really much more than that, because they're always thinking about the issue. They may care deeply about that. And then the fourth and most important tactic, and this is the interpersonal idea of how to deal with change and swampy conditions, is people are genuinely fear change and fear differences in how you approach problems and how you work. And so Biller's advice was that you really have to lead by example. And you're kind of walking people through problems by holding their hand. But you have to hold their hand lightly. You can't be dragging them because they think you're dragging them over a cliff. They only like it when you hold their hand lightly so they can let go and you go over the cliff by yourself. So in applying these, I would ask you, and this is just a 2-minute exercise, no more than 15, 20 seconds on each. Think about in your work, what's a predetermined solution that you think you should let go of? This sounds a lot easier than it is. I mean, there's research out there on how difficult it is for us to drop our tools. We're all trained as problem solvers, and so we come up with solutions. But and I'm not going to ask you to report out. This isn't something to put in the chat room. This is for you, and to help you as you move forward to really internalize these tactics and how you can apply it. So what's the first, what's a predetermined solution that you might let go of? 2, what questions on whatever issue you want to embrace in this, what questions do you think you need to ask? What questions are not being asked that you need to ask. And just write down the most important one right now, or if it's so sensitive, just memorize it, okay? But otherwise, think about what question should we, the power is through the power of inquiry. And this is consistent with leadership research that looks at leadership as not providing the answers, but providing the questions. What questions need to be answered? It's leadership is inquiry. And it ties in, and it's really how you can operationalize what Laree's talking about the power of listening and of connecting with people about what they care deeply about. Thirdly, think about on what you're working with, who's in opposition. Try not to get PTSD thinking about it, but who opposes this? And how might you ask them? Now, first, they'll be very skeptical because they're going to be wondering, like, why are you asking me this? So it has to be that you genuinely want to know the depth of their opposition, okay? And explore. It doesn't mean that you'll agree with it, but it's better to get, they might be thinking of questions that you haven't thought about in number 2. And so they're raising the key issue. And then fourth, why would people fear the change that you're proposing? I put it really mildly. Why is change of concern? No, it's way beyond that. I mean, I remember one time working with a group, they wanted to switch chairs in between sessions. And I thought, if you won't change chairs and tables and sit with different people, how hard is it to get at other issues? So this is a question of why would they fear this? It's not just that they're concerned about it, but how would they see this as hurting them personally or professionally? So I've talked through each of these. You have these questions. I'm not going to spend a lot of time now giving you more time on that, but I'd encourage you, if you want to act on it. The most effective teacher I ever had took tremendous notes. And he took notes on learning judo in Japan. And you couldn't get a more physical activity, but he just didn't rely on that he would remember. And it gave him a game plan. And time again, I see people who are effective in leadership positions. It's what a former county executive, Chet Hewitt, describes as they have an intentionality. So this is an exercise to not only help you develop and make explicit what you're doing implicitly and your tactics in swampy conditions, but how to be intentional about it and how to work with other people to teach them that as well. So, and again, in the chat room, you can email me, my email's here, my phone's here, and same with Laree. We welcome any follow-up. If you think we've gone through something too quickly, we haven't done it in the right depth, we really love getting emails that say, Laree, Rich, you're the greatest. But we also deeply value emails that say, I didn't understand that, or I think you have it exactly backwards. And then we'll work through that with you. So we look at this session today as being ongoing conversation and sharing this with you. And we welcome your continued discussion if there's any way we can be of help in following up on anything we covered today. So shifting from this, but along the lines of inquiry, what we'd like to ask you to finish up on, and we promised to finish by 4:15, so we're on target, on the chat room. We'd ask you to write what you might carry forward from today. Just can be a sentence, 2 sentences. Write something. Oh, and if there's nothing, write nothing. That's okay, because then Laree and I will know, hey, we were really off the mark. We wasted their valuable time. They have to deal with COVID, and they have to deal with 2 presenters who offered nothing of value in an hour. We might as well learn that the hard way, okay? So this is an exercise I've done with health policy leaders from throughout the country through a program I work with the Milbank Foundation. And for them, it was really valuable because there were ways that Medicaid was streamlining and improving waivers that had never happened before. And there were better practices that telemedicine, for example, they really hope to carry forward. So part of asking you right in the chat room is, one of the roles of leaders is to really inspire other people. So it's not just what you're finding working, but you might see something that really is a valuable message to others, and your willingness to share that we all benefit from. So take another 30 seconds, write something.
We've
Chat.
got a couple of comments here too, Rich, but and a question that's really good, fantastic. One of these questions is, does it make change any easier for people when it's mandated from a higher power than our organization? And the answer to that is, it depends on if they agree with it.
Yes, and there's also a considerable body of research that people in the social determinants of health, particularly Michael Marmot in his book, The Health Gap, when people don't feel they have any control over their work setting, that becomes enormously problematic. It's not just, so I agree with Laree that it depends, but a consistent pattern where people are just feel they don't have input into decision making or any control over their job, that really leads can lead to negative personal health outcomes.
Good question from Bob. And Michael says, more patients listening to dissenting opinions and don't make it about the nail in the head. Sometimes I just need to listen and not problem solve. That's real leadership, my friend, is listening to people when it's appropriate. Jan says how to frame messages, emphasize what you want them to do rather than planting the opposite idea in their mind. Yeah. Debbie says use curiosity to gain more information. We've got some really good answers. Focus on facts. These are the things people are taking away. This is wonderful. We're so pleased to see that. Even if you just take one thing from today back to where you're going and help people navigate this crazy time right now. Alex says, I really appreciate and value this skill and the ability of co-creation. Yes. So we'll capture all these. These will help us also figure out where to go next. Yep. Rich and I are the first ones out here, so thank you for your patience with us. And we really enjoyed building this and really enjoyed sharing it with you. It's about time. Go ahead, Rich.
I see Debbie's comment on curiosity, and I've always been struck by the connection between leaders I've found remarkably effective, and they have a curious mind. And Bob Biller, they have a curiosity. Their mind's not curious. Biller used to say, he goes, as I got older, I realized I could learn from any situation if I was open to it. And so our next question and final question is really our interest in learning from you about your suggestions on adjustments. We've worked with you. You're the first ones to participate in this. We welcome you posting any suggestions for adjustments. And if you don't feel comfortable doing it in the chat room, email Bill Chiat, email Laree, email myself. Be really helpful. I have a question about would these notes be available for us who've been to the training? Let me follow up with Bill and see what works well for the Institute on that. Thank you for that question.
Well, first of all, please join me in thanking Rich and Laree. We can do a silent clap all across the state for the contributions. And yes, we have recorded this webinar and we'll be posting it on our website, and we will be transcribing the chat and including that along with the slides from today. So you will be getting a link to all of that once it gets posted. We've also just sent you a very brief but different evaluation to pick up on the last slide that Laree and Rich were sharing. One, we wanted to hear about your thoughts about this, but part of this is also to learn more about what your desires are for virtual learning from the Institute. So we've got several questions about, as we go forward, what kinds of things would you like to see in the virtual learning opportunities coming from CSAC Institute? Again, thank you to Laree and Rich. Thank you to all of you for participating. Stay healthy, stay well, and thank you for all that you're doing to serve the people of your counties. Take care.